Good morning, folks, and thank you for joining me again about morning coffee time for a little bit of a history reflection. And as you'll recall, if this is not your first time here, we're going at a chapter at a time through Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge's wonderful book, Hero Tales of American History. And we've gotten as far as an independent nation and the battles of the Revolution that helped establish the nation so. And then we changed gears last time and talked about an act of both moral and physical courage, but not a military story regarding our ambassador during the French Revolution. Now we find the young nation acting on the world stage for the first time, and Cabot and Lodge have some strong comments to make about the situation that the United States found themselves in. And remember, in the early 1800s, it would still be the United States, plural. And the United States had realized suddenly that our merchants overseas, those who sailed and carried the New World's goods and brought back prosperity and needed trade goods from overseas, because we were an independent nation, our sailing ships were no longer protected by the British Navy. That had been the situation before when we were still a British possession, but now they were not. And because they were not, we found ourselves in a in a very uncomfortable position indeed. And I'm going to kick off with Roosevelt and Lodge's description of the situation of people who were called the Barbary Pirates. These are North African tribes. They're technically part of the Muslim Ottoman Empire out of Turkey, but they don't really answer to the Ottoman Emperor other than to send him tribute once in a while. And they themselves are demanding tribute. Large bribes from our nation to leave our ships alone, or else they will, as they often did, capture and steal our ships in the Mediterranean and put the crews, sell the crews into slavery. That has been their policy. So let's hear what our statesmen have to say about this. It is difficult to conceive that there was ever a time when the United States paid money tribute to anybody. It is even more difficult to imagine the United States paying blackmail to a set of small piratical tribes on the coast of Africa. This description by Roosevelt and Lodge is dripping with contempt for that policy. Yet this is precisely what we once did with the Barbary powers, as they were called, the states of Morocco, Tunis, Tripoli, and Algiers, lying along the northern coast of Africa. The only excuse to be made for such action was that we merely followed the example of Christendom. The civilized people of the world were then in the habit of paying sums of money to these miserable pirates. For this purpose, Congress appropriated money and treaties were made by the president and ratified by the Senate. On one occasion, Congress actually revoked the authorization of some new ships for the Navy and appropriated more money than was required to build the men of war in order to buy off the Barbary powers. The fund for this disgraceful purpose was known as the Mediterranean Fund. Well, that describes the situation, I think, with a proper outrage, that the United States should, as a young nation, decide that sort of paying protection money to not be picked on by these powers in North Africa. It was done for monetary reasons, and also because the new nation was very leery of developing any serious military power. And if you really want to get into that part of the story, I recommend the book Six Frigates by Ian Toll, about the decision and the early service of the decision that the new nation actually needed a navy. You see, we had a navy, which helped us to win the American Revolution. And then once we got independence, we had actually gotten rid of our navy. We didn't have one whatsoever for years. And when it was restarted, it was partly because of this problem overseas and our leaders realizing, hey, it's not a very nice world out there, and we're not really sealed off in North America all by ourselves. We need trade, and those who carry out trade need protection. We've got to provide it for ourselves. Which brings us to the next bit of our story, involving a young officer of the new United States Navy, young Stephen Decatur. Decatur is a man on the spot in a very uncomfortable situation in the Mediterranean. When we sent a naval squadron to the Mediterranean, we sent a small group of warships to resolve this situation and change our policy that, no, we're not going to pay you guys bribes anymore. We are going to begin to protect our ships if you mess with them. And this resulted in these little squabbling pirate tribes posturing back and forth with one another. And we had a couple of successful fights with them, won by the original USS Enterprise. There has been a USS Enterprise in commission in the Navy for, I believe, almost all of American naval history. That Enterprise, of course, was a small sailing ship. And aboard the Enterprise in its successful fight, not as the commander, but as a naval lieutenant, is this young man, Stephen Decatur. He's worth a biography session all by himself. That's beyond our scope today. But Decatur is the man on the spot when this situation of Mediterranean Danegeld comes to a height. That's kind of a funny word, but I use it because Roosevelt and Lodge both would have known and probably memorized the Rudyard Kipling poem called Danegeld. Danegeld in the late Middle Ages, was the money used to pay the Vikings to not attack you. And Kipling wrote a famous poem about statesmanship, referring to this form of bribery or blackmail called Danegeld, and advising that you never pay it. And so our ceasing to pay blackmail to these pirates, not to send them large bribes to leave us alone, was an end to the Danegeld policy. But of course, if you don't pay the Danegeld, you wind up fighting. And you see on the left a map of Tripoli. Tripoli, perhaps best known in modern day as part of the first line of the Marine Corps hymn, from the halls of Montezuma, which is in Mexico, to the shores of Tripoli, which is in northern Africa. And you see here that Tripoli has a large harbor, and the Pasha's castle, that's a huge fortification, but there are other fortifications that cover the harbor. And you see on the right the frigate Philadelphia. The United States frigate Philadelphia was a 44-gun ship, a significant chunk of our Navy, one of our best ships. But pursuing some pirates into the harbor of Tripoli, ran aground, and this was a disaster. In the middle of enemy territory, under the guns of the enemy forts, a helpless United States ship, which had to surrender to the pirate prince there. And the Tripolitans acquired this ship, brought it into their own harbor, and anchored her under the guns of the Pasha's fort. That sets up our situation. It's a terrible humiliation for the new nation. If you can imagine a major warship, not a rowboat, not a PT boat, but a major warship of the United States being captured and held by an enemy power, and not even a major one, but these little upstart African pirates. You can imagine how that looked to the world. Now, here we have another view of the harbor itself, the town, remember where the fort was. And this is where a certain exploit is going to take place. The Tripolitans got the Philadelphia off the rocks, towed her into the harbor, and anchored her close under the guns of their forts. They also replaced her batteries. Now, those are not AA batteries. Those are cannons. Sets of cannons were called batteries. And prepared to make her ready for sea. Under these circumstances, Stephen Decatur, a young lieutenant now in command of the Enterprise, offered to Commodore Preble to go into the harbor and destroy the Philadelphia. A small vessel known as a ketch, K-E-T-C-H, had recently been captured from the Tripolitans by Decatur, and the prize was now named the Intrepid and assigned to him for the work he had in hand. He took 70 men from his own ship, and accompanied by Lieutenant Stewart and the Siren, who was to support him, he set sail for Tripoli. He and his crew were very much cramped as well as badly fed on the little vessel that had been given to them, but they succeeded in reaching Tripoli in safety, accompanied by the Siren. On February 16th, the weather moderated and Decatur determined to go in. It is well to recall the extreme peril of the attack he was about to make. The Philadelphia, with 40 guns mounted, double-shotted, referring to extra projectiles being put in the cannons for use at short range, but in a very devastating way, and ready for firing and manned by a full complement of men, was moored within half a gunshot to the Bashaw's castle, the Mole and Crown batteries, and within range of 10 other batteries. So that's 13 batteries or sets, groups of cannons, which can fire toward the Philadelphia, mounting altogether 115 guns. Some Tripolitan cruisers, 2 galleys, and 19 gunboats also lay between the Philadelphia and the shore. So this prize has a huge ring of defense around it, and Decatur is heading in with this little vessel with 4 small guns and a crew of 75 men. The Americans, however, were entirely undismayed by the odds against them. You see here what was called the Mole. That's one of the places where cannons were set, as well as the corner there of Bashaw's castle. And at 7 o'clock, Decatur went into the harbor between the reef and shoal which formed its mouth. He steered on steadily toward the Philadelphia, the breeze getting constantly lighter, and by 9:30 was within 200 yards of the frigate. As they approached, Decatur stood at the helm with the pilot, only 2 or 3 men showing on deck, the rest of the crew lying hidden under the bulwarks. Roosevelt does not add that the men on deck were dressed in Arab dress to blend in with the Arab pirates. and with the general traffic going in and out of the harbor. He drifted to within nearly 20 yards of the Philadelphia. The suspicions of the Tripolitans, however, were not aroused. When they hailed the Intrepid, the pilot answered they had lost their anchors in a gale and asked they might run a warp to the frigate and ride by her. Okay, that's some naval terminology Roosevelt and Lodge expect you to know. Basically, the ship was requesting assistance, saying that they were drifting, they need to tie some ropes to the Philadelphia in order to stabilize their ship for repairs. When the talk went on, the Intrepid's boat crew shoved off with the rope and, pulling to the forechains of the Philadelphia, made the line fast. So now they've tied the two ships together, which, of course, is what you would do if you were going to attack. But they've done it as a trick, claiming to need repairs. A few of the crew began to haul on the lines. The suspicions of the Tripolitans were now at last awakened. They raised the cry, "Americanos!" and ordered off the Intrepid, but it was too late. Decatur sprang up the main chains of the Philadelphia, calling out the order to board. His officers and men rapidly followed him. And as they swarmed over the rails and came onto the deck, the Tripolitan crew gathered, panic-stricken in a confused mass on the forecastle. Decatur waited a moment until his men were behind him, then placing himself at their head, drew his sword and rushed upon the Tripolitans. It was a very short struggle, and the Tripolitans, crowded together, terrified and surprised, were cut down or driven overboard. In 5 minutes, the ship was cleared of the enemy. Decatur would have liked to have taken the Philadelphia out of the harbor, but that was impossible. He therefore gave orders to burn the ship, and his men, who'd been thoroughly instructed in what they were to do, they had run this drill many times, actually, dispersed into all parts of the frigate with the combustibles which had been prepared. They don't have plastic explosive charges to set here. They have to set everything on fire the old-fashioned way. And in a few minutes, so well and quickly was the work done, the flames broke out on all parts of the Philadelphia. And the Tripolitan pirates realized that their great prize is rapidly burning away to nothing. It was a moment of great danger, for fire was breaking out on all sides, and the Intrepid herself, filled as she was with powder and combustibles, was in great peril of sudden destruction. And these old sailing ships, warships, carrying a great deal of gunpowder, if flames reached the magazine, you could have the ship explode. The rapidity of Decatur's movements, however, saved everything. The cables were cut, the sweeps got out, and the Intrepid drew rapidly away from the burning frigate. It was a magnificent sight, as the flames burst out over the Philadelphia and ran rapidly and fiercely up the masts and rigging. As her guns became heated, they discharged, one battery pouring its shots into town. Finally, the cables parted, and the Philadelphia, a mass of flames, drifted across the harbor and blew up. Why has this never been a major Hollywood movie? Meantime, the batteries of the shipping and castle have been turned upon the Intrepid. The American Ketch, the smaller ship you see there in the foreground, is under a crossfire from forts and ships, more than 100 land-based guns, more than 20 gunboats in the harbor. But although the shot struck all around her, she escaped successfully with only one shot through her mainsail and bore away. This successful attack was carried through by the cool courage of Decatur and his men. The hazard was very great, the odds were very heavy, and everything depended on the nerve with which the attack was made and the completeness of the surprise. Nothing miscarried, and no success could have been more complete. Nelson, at that time in the Mediterranean, and the best judge of a naval exploit, as well as the greatest naval commander who ever lived, pronounced it the most bold and daring act of the age. Roosevelt and Lodge are very proud of this compliment that the great British admiral who defeated the French at Trafalgar, that this British admiral paid a compliment to the upstart American Navy and the amazing feat that was carried off by Lieutenant Stephen Decatur and his band of men. We meet no single feat exactly like it in our naval history, brilliant as that has been, until we come to Cushing's destruction of the Albemarle in the War of the Rebellion. We'll get to that a little bit later. Decatur's burning of the Philadelphia has been well nigh forgotten, but it is one of those feats of arms which illustrate the high courage of American seamen, and which ought always to be remembered. So, as always, Roosevelt and Lodge give us an exciting and a action-packed story. And as always, it's worth taking a second to think about why and what the message is they're getting across. Because remember, Hero Tales is not simply a book of entertaining adventure stories. It's a book that does have entertaining adventure stories, but also is trying to drive home lessons about what the American virtues ought to be, what our leadership should look like, what our decision-making should look like. And for the first time in the Hero Tales, here in the early 1800s, Roosevelt and Lodge refer to something that's not just a matter of personal leadership, but national honor. They are quite adamant that paying bribes, paying Danegeld, paying blackmail to what they refer to as these miserable pirates, they're trying to communicate something very strong there. And it is that in matters of national honor, that in the long run and the short run, you are better off taking the hard line and the confrontation against people who are being predatory and abusive, as the Barbary pirates were. That just paying them to leave you alone is not a wise course of action, but that's not what they emphasize the most in this story. They emphasize that it is not an honorable course of action, that it is not the right thing for people to do, even if, as they say, everyone else is. And they say the only excuse for America paying that money was that it was the example set by Christendom, by which they mean the countries of Europe at that point. So a very interesting story, a very interesting man, Stephen Decatur. I commend to you to look up and read more about his biography, his many exploits. He is the man from which we get a quote, "My country, right or wrong." That wasn't the full quote. It was part of a toast. And in context, it doesn't mean what it sounds like it means when people refer to it today. So I commend you to read more about Stephen Decatur. Meanwhile, this month, we are doing much more about naval history. The next two of the Hero Tales, both are stories from the age of sail. October 13th will be the birthday of the U.S. Navy, so we've hit our Navy topics on the Navy's own month. And it just so happens that both of our Homeschool Fridays, which are also invited to this month, are both also on Navy topics. We'll talk about the privateers of Charleston on October 10th, I think it is, 9th. And on the 16th of October, we're going to be having a session on commerce raiders in the 1860s and in World War I. So thank you all for joining me. I went even later than usual, and I appreciate your patience. Does anybody have a question or a comment before we wrap up?